Now, in a world increasingly defined by division, conflict, and uncertainty, from ongoing war in the Middle East to deepening political polarization in the United States and beyond, there is a growing call for unity, understanding, and dialogue. On the 7th of June 2024, the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly responded to that call by unanimously adopting a resolution to establish June 10 as the International Day for Dialogue among Civilizations, a day set aside to remind us of our shared humanity and the power of peaceful engagements across cultures, faith, and ideologies. But what does this mean in practical terms? Why now? And how can this global observance inspire meaningful change in a world still gripped by conflict and mistrust? Well, to unpack the deeper significance of this development and also just to explore its implications both globally and locally, we're now joined virtually by political analyst Mr. Cedric McCay. Mr. McCay, a very good morning to you and thank you so much for making time to talk to us.
Good morning to you.
All right. Just to get into it, what is the significance of the UN establishing June 10 as the International Day for Dialogue among Civilizations, especially at a time when global tension is very high?
In fact, it is very high. We see things right across the globe, and I think that this day and its establishment is to say in a sense, the old tools have not worked. The sort of military bullying, economic isolation, and that sort of thing, it's not useful anymore as a diplomatic tool. That if we're going to go forward, I think we communications, respect, to listen to one another, respect the dignity of each other. It's a different approach than what we've seen recently, even an approach this similar to what we're seeing being practiced right now. The Middle East, if we look at what we might see even in the United States and what we see happening in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, we know that listening to one another and developing a shared narrative with your neighbor and with your friends, respecting their dignity and their humanity is something that can be much more helpful than the strategies that we've been using for so far because they don't seem to be working very well. So the establishment of this day, I think, is a hopefulness, is a statement of faith and belief that humanity, by listening to one another and talking with one another, hearing each other and seeing each other in dignity and in respect, it's a hopeful approach to solving some problems which we all must work together to solve, notably things like climate change and some others.
Yeah. Now, speaking of some of those problems, so we're looking at the conflicts like the ongoing war in the Middle East, but how can dialogue among civilization help address or just ease some of these conflicts?
Part of the problem that we're having in the Middle East is certainly there's an imbalance of weapons. We understand that, but they don't seem to see each other in their world vision and their world view. There isn't a shared narrative of how they both must be respected and permitted to exist and to see each other. And so it becomes a bit of perhaps for some of the participants or even the belligerents, if we want to use a term uh, related to war, they're operating with a zero sum game approach that it's all or none. That's not going to work. We see that it's ineffective. It's not going to be able to be sustained. So we have to be able to talk to one another and develop a shared narrative of how we're going to exist together. And so we see that it is necessary and we pray useful in places like the Middle East to help human beings understand that we have to engage one another respectfully and that we have to share our planet, we have to share our space on the planet.
All right. In your view, Mr. McKay, why did the UN decide to adopt this resolution unanimously now? What does the timing tell us about the current state of international relations?
I've been thinking about that for a while. This resolution was passed last year, and from the perspective of what we saw within the United States, where I'm based, we saw Joe Biden, President Biden at the time, seeking reelection against a candidate who had already been president, Donald Trump. And so things moved very quickly after that and sort of have shifted in ways I don't think anyone has expected. There was a hopefulness then, I think last June, May and June, when this was moving forward to being unanimously accepted, that we could sort of tone down, I think, some of the rhetoric that we saw coming from various corners of the world, including within the United States, where the UN headquarters is based in New York City. But we've seen it even get worse since then. Coming from the current president of the United States, directed externally and internally. We see a certain intolerance, even of the North American neighbors, and we see a participation of the United States government and support of the U.S. government, military action in the Middle East, and one side of the war in Europe between Ukraine and Russia. So there was certainly a statement to be made, I think, at that time that, listen, this old military bullying, economic isolation, and political isolation, which has been tried fairly unsuccessfully against Russia, is not the way forward. Dropping bombs in Khartoum to support one side or the other isn't helpful for the people of Sudan. And what we see happening in Gaza certainly isn't helpful for the people of Gaza, and they have been killed by numbers that are just shocking. It's also not going to be helpful for the people of the state of Israel. Their peace and security won't be secured this way. So there was a hopefulness that, listen, now is the time for us to begin to talk, and now is the time for us to find a common understanding of our mutual purposefulness is on the planet by discussing with each other. That was the situation in June. The situations right around the world seem to have worsened. So there's even more of a need for this understanding that we have got to relate to one another, respect one another, not just through power, but through principle.
Yeah. Now, saying that we're speaking about dialogues and just having conversations in general, how realistic is it to expect meaningful dialogue and also understanding between deeply divided nations and also just political groups, also just given the recent global events like political unrest in the US?
I don't think we have much of a choice, do we? I mean, if we wait much longer, the situation is going to be very grave. The situation will be aggravated, let's say, if we don't begin the process of understanding each other. And I think that what we see across the African continent can be a model and an example of what has happened in the post colonial transitions from colonization, sometimes apartheid and colonization, to moving through dialogue and through understanding and discussion toward a peaceful resolution, and trying to move forward together without using war, without using attack and violence as the only means to resolve concerns or disagreements or perceived differences. And so we know that when people are willing to confront hard truths, and when civil society, young people, the faith communities can get involved in this, the education communities can get involved in this. We know that they can help reframe the narratives and shift the understandings away from war and disagreement to having a common understanding of the mutuality of our humanity and the way that we have to share our planet, and we have to share the resources on the planet, or we're at significant and great risk of putting all of us in harm's way.
Yeah. But what role can countries like Namibia and its civil society play in promoting this day's message of dialogue and also just peace?
Namibia has a unique history, I think, and perhaps because of that history, it might be fair to say it. And I don't mean to be. I'm not saying this just because I'm a guest on Good Morning Namibia. I think Namibia has a particular role coming through colonization and apartheid, a particular history, and its stance on a very strong civil society. Namibia has a moral voice, I think, that can be used to say, "Hey, this can happen. You can actually talk to one another. You can help see one another through discussion, through dialogue, and help each other understand your positions and move forward." Now, that's not, no one's perfect, and I can't say that Namibia's history on this has been perfect, but I respect the effort to say we are going to have to use dialogue in the situation on the recognition of the genocide, which has happened right there, and what we now understand as Namibia. Through dialogue, trying to find resolution and trying to find an understanding of how to bring a solution that's going to be helpful for all parties to it through discussion, not through throwing darts at one another. So a country like Namibia can express a certain experience and a certain moral voice that might be a leadership role for others who are trying to find their footing in this. Or some people are used to fighting. And this is an example where those who are successful and have some experience in discussion and dialogue can take the lead, because we absolutely need it. We're not doing so well in some parts of the world, and this sort of leadership could be tremendously helpful.
Yeah. Apart from Namibia's example, are there perhaps any other historical examples where dialogue among different civilizations or cultures successfully prevented conflict or perhaps fostered peace that we can actually learn from?
I can think of a couple as I'm sitting here. I would think about the it was Nkrumah, who hosted a conference in Accra, I think it was 1958, bringing together in a sort of a Pan African movement, African leadership in Accra to talk about how to use dialogue to get through the end of colonization and not solely relying upon violence. Some people didn't seem some in some places. I'm looking at the example of Kenya. It seems as if violence was one of the ways that people thought would be successful to get attention. In other places and in other spaces, dialogue was really supported as a primary means to sort of help bring about the end of colonization, um, and transferring into independent government on the African continent. Uh, I can think of maybe a couple of more examples. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was an example. Trust me, I understand that it was discussed robustly. Not everybody agreed with its method of operation, or perhaps how it was rolled out, but it stands as an example of where dialogue and discussion and common understanding and talking and using and developing a narrative of a shared narrative was able to sort of get through very difficult and tough moments as a nation, without throwing rocks or bullets at each other. And I guess if I were to go back a little bit to my own childhood, I would think about the Camp David Accords. Menachem Begin, Yasser Arafat in Camp David, President Jimmy Carter there. Uh, Egypt had been kicked out of the Arab League. Israel was always under the threat of being attacked by its neighbors, but through discussion, they were able to find peace that has been more or less lasting between Egypt and Israel, maybe not so much between some of Israel's other neighbors. So we know that there's a lot of work to be done, but there are examples where this process of talking and developing a shared narrative and a common understanding, and understanding the shared history that civilizations have been successful and have helped to produce peaceful outcomes where violence was before then a first option.
All right. Now, seeing that yesterday was the very first time that this day was being commemorated, what would you say would be some of the practical steps that government, communities, and individuals need to take to move beyond symbolic observance towards real impact on peace and understanding?
It can't just be a day where we celebrate and say fine speeches and sing beautiful songs and talk about, we all get together. This has to be institutionalized, right? This notion of discussion and dialogue has to be institutionalized. And so governments have to think about ways to create forums that are ongoing, that are intercultural, that perhaps are interfaith, that where the education systems, the schools, the universities can talk about historical literacy, that can talk about looking at your neighbor with empathy, using critical thinking as a part of your dialogue, not just listening so that you can make your point when the other person has finished speaking, but listening with a sense of intelligence and empathy. And so, we can talk about some of the tough issues that we have before us. There are some very serious issues around race and gender, language, land. But let's approach these discussions not as debates where one person has to be right and the other person has to be wrong, but as mutual learning where we can learn from one another. We can understand each other's positions. And I think that, individuals can be very seriously engaged in active listening and rejecting stereotypes. But I think that governments can play a role to encourage others to sort of, and government can institutionalize the process of encouraging others to sort of see ourselves with respect and see others also with respect. It's there's a role for government to play. I think some governments are doing better, and we hope that more of them will continue to do better. But it can't just be sing a nice song on this day and tell a speech. It has to be the day-to-day work of government, supported by civil society, supported by the education systems, and supported by community groups and cultural groups, all working together toward this goal of listening to our neighbors, listening to each other, and developing a narrative of ourselves that includes everybody respectfully.
Well, Mr. McKay, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
I'm happy to join you. And I heard you speak earlier about enjoying the winter. Listen, my dear, if I could send you all the snow in Chicago that we have in the winter, it would only be my pleasure. So I hope you enjoy your cold and good morning, Namibia.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Well, that was Cedric McCay, who is a political analyst, joining us this morning, talking to us about June 10th, which is now commemorated as the International Day for Dialogue Among Civilizations. More conversation coming your way. To stay with us.